Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. It has been a second since I have done a podcast. And the reason, quite frankly, is that I have been tired. I talk a decent amount in my podcast with my clients, in my newsletter, about the fact that we as humans are stoppable. And we shouldn't just act like we're robots who can just keep going no matter what. And team, I have been stopped by life recently. I am sure I'll share more at some point, but briefly, I have had a lot of very, very high energy expenses the past 2 months, particularly due to some parenting commitments. And those of you who know me know that I love talking about energy like it's money. It just makes a lot of sense to me. And honestly, despite my very best efforts to avoid it, I got in some pretty significant energy debt. And so with very limited energy available, I've just been prioritizing myself and my family and my one-on-one clients and letting my other business activities like this podcast just take a rest for a bit. And I share about this for two reasons. Obviously, one of those reasons is because I know that at least some of you were asking me about the podcast, which, let's be clear, I am so honored that you've been enjoying it and would even notice its absence. So I just want you to know what's been up for me. And also because I want to be an example of the idea that we can have successful and meaningful personal and professional lives. And we can also have periods within that where we, sometimes for reasons beyond our control, get stopped by life and have to rest and regroup and pay off that energy debt for a while. So I am here to be an example and to say that it can be done. We can build lives that we really like and do work that we are proud of, and we can do that while being human and stoppable. So that's that. And speaking of parenthood and exhaustion, today's podcast is about motherhood. Actually, this episode is about more than parenthood and exhaustion. That's just me being a little sassy, but it's not about parenthood and exhaustion. Does that make sense? I recently asked my email newsletter list if they had any questions they'd like for me to answer on the podcast, and I got a bunch of really good ones. So today I wanted to answer the first of those questions, which is about motherhood and the transition to motherhood. The high-level summary of this question from my reader Noelle is this: how do I gracefully transition to motherhood from a career-oriented 30-year-old with no kids and no role models? And here's the full details. Noelle wrote into me, "Hi, Katie. I'm so excited that you have this Q&A idea. So my husband and I have been together for our entire 20s. And now that I hit 30, we decided it was a good time to try for a family. Now that I'm pregnant, I'm realizing all the beautiful and scary changes that are to come. I've been 1,000%, actually, I think she even wrote 10,000% focused on my career my entire life. And I'm already needing to slow down from the pregnancy symptoms. My husband has an intense medical career. He's eager to participate, but definitely will be taking second chair with the childcare. And I find myself with some questions. How do I embrace my new identity as a mother without worrying about my career? How do I manage my career without losing too much of what I struggled for? And how do I make decisions like this when my brain doesn't feel caught up?" Noelle also wrote in, "I have explored ideas like working part-time and from home, and they seem appealing. For context, we will be having the first grandbaby on all sides, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom, so I'm afraid I don't have too many role models for what a career and mom situation could look like. From listening to your podcast about your kids, I figured you might be the perfect person to tackle this, and thank you for everything." So first of all, Noelle, I just want to say huge congratulations on your pregnancy. This is a huge life thing. In my opinion, it's a huge thing in a wonderful way. I have really loved being a mom. And also, in my opinion, it is a huge thing in that it can be intimidating and overwhelming. I am so glad you asked this question because I had been feeling an urge to talk about parenthood in some capacity on the podcast, but I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to say about it. I don't really consider myself a parenting expert. For those of you who don't know, I have twin boys. My sons just turned 3 a few weeks ago. And as of this recording, I still honestly think of myself as kind of like a parenting newbie. But this question to me is really about identity and priorities and time and really how our commitments to being a mother or a parent fit in with all of the other things that we are committed to. And I have a lot of thoughts on those topics. So Noelle, I often like to kind of break down what the struggle is more concretely to make sure that I'm really addressing the entirety of it. So I heard 2 general categories of things to address in your question about how to transition gracefully to motherhood. One was there were some points about identity. You said, how do I embrace my new identity as a mother? And then there were some really concrete questions about priorities and time. In particular, you talked about struggling to figure out how you'll balance your career and your parenting, both on a day-to-day basis and also in a bigger, more long-term way. So I do want to address both of these areas, both identity and also the choices we make about our time. And I also want to just say that I love your intuition, Noelle, that you could use more role models. I know that role models have been incredibly useful for me. I think sometimes it's just easier to kind of pick from a menu of options versus just imagining something from nothing. So along the way, I just want to share a bit about some of the people who were some of my role models in case they were helpful for you or anyone else listening to this. And I'll also share more about some of my own decisions in the hopes that, again, I'm not a parenting expert, but that's, the way that the choices that I have made, my process of decision making could allow me to be a role model for you if you want it, or for anyone else if it's useful. So with that in mind, let's get started. So the first piece of advice I want to give you is to arrive how you arrive to motherhood. The felt sense I got in reading your question was that it might feel kind of jostly inside of you right now. It makes complete sense to me that you might have a variety of genuinely mixed feelings about being a mom. Yes, excitement, but also ambivalence, especially about what you fear you might be giving up in your career that you've worked so hard for. You said in your question that you were looking for ideas on how to transition gracefully to motherhood. And I want to name that I love that word choice, that you're looking to be graceful. I think the problem is that ideally, when we say we want to be graceful, we're imagining ourselves gracefully gliding across the ice like Michelle Kwan. And when we don't feel like that at all, and you may feel pretty messy right now, there's a natural instinct that maybe we should just tamp down on it all so we can then hopefully glide across the ice like Michelle Kwan. But here's the thing. When we feel messy or ambivalent, I think the most graceful thing to do in basically every situation is not to fight the fact that we feel messy or ambivalent. Because when we fight it, then even if we successfully kind of keep the feelings tamped down, we still do feel messy and exhausted and jostly, or at least exhausted from the effort that it takes to keep that mess or ambivalence down. And it kind of pops up at inconvenient moments and it's all pretty stressful. And none of that feels graceful. Ultimately, I think your most graceful option is always to feel ambivalent when you feel ambivalent. It's graceful to feel messy when you feel messy. There is a peacefulness to, at the very least, not fighting what you actually feel. So that's one reason why I suggest that you let yourself arrive how you arrive to motherhood. There's also a second reason why I suggest this, and I want to share a little kind of personal bit about me before I say what that reason is. So totally candidly, for me, I felt very ambivalent about motherhood during my pregnancy. Part of that was that I was freaked out To be totally honest, once I realized we'd be having twins, they were just natural, spontaneous twins. We didn't do IVF, and neither my husband nor I have any history of natural twins in our family. So it was a surprise, and I was scared about what that would be like with two infants. And also, I was not someone who had spent her whole life dreaming of becoming a mom. I had, once I'd gotten to my late 20s, felt a kind of intuitive sense that I did want the experience of being a mother to at least one child. But I had never been one of those people who loves babies or kids and works as a babysitter and was a camp counselor and just loves looking at babies on the street. I was basically never a babysitter or a camp counselor, and I didn't really like babies on the street that much. So there was a decent part of me, even as I was growing these two creatures inside of me, that was like, wait, am I even going to like being a mom? And given what I will be giving up in terms of time and energy and money, will it even be worth it? I could imagine, Noelle, if you're talking about motherhood with your own mom or your mother-in-law, even if they did feel some ambivalence at the time, they might not even remember it. They might just remember the good parts. And with our generation, I think it's changing. I think the conversation about what it's like to be a mother is changing. But I think most people even now do lead with their positive feelings about motherhood, often without acknowledging maybe more honest, kind of mixed feelings about the whole thing. So I just want to be an example of another woman who was ambivalent during my pregnancy. I will also say, in the spirit of being just another woman who is a couple of steps ahead of you on this particular path, that I was very delighted and honestly relieved to find that I felt a remarkable intensity of feelings for my kids once they came out. We could call it attachment or love, but really, and I can feel it even as I talk about it now, it's this like deep in my bones felt experience of, oh my God, it feels so good to just be around my babies. Just like I said, in my bones, as deep as it goes. It's honestly a very odd experience, and I'm not sure I've ever felt something quite like this about anything else in my life. I'm not sure I've ever felt attachment from such a like primal like place before. And of course, doesn't this make all the sense in the world that a mother might feel this way about her children? I mean, this is how our species perpetuates itself, but that experience, again, was unlike anything I have experienced. And to be clear, this does not mean that I want to be around my kids every single second, or that parts of motherhood are not astoundingly difficult. And of course, not everyone has this particular experience. This is just to say that, again, for me, as a sample size of one, it was such a pleasure to let myself be ambivalent when I was genuinely ambivalent, when that was my authentic experience, and then suddenly turn around and be like, wow, I guess I'm not ambivalent at all. That transition, when it did happen, was such a surprise, such a delight, and it really did feel, when it came, like the experience of being a figure skater gliding across the ice. It felt effortless, this transition into this new way of being. So I say that because I would love to recommend to you at least the possibility that something like that might happen to you. That you might, at some point, the exact moment is hard to predict, gracefully arrive. And you will gracefully arrive how and when you are going to gracefully arrive. But when it happens, if you don't fight it, it feels really nice. As I said, your graceful arrival may not be at the exact time as mine was. It might be later. But I would particularly like to recommend that experience to you because, number one, as I said, it felt really good. And two, I'm not really sure you have a choice. If you try to drag yourself to a new identity that doesn't feel true to you, I think you'll feel it for the lie that it is. And again, this is not to say that you have to tell every single person in your life that you are currently feeling ambivalence. It just means that the number one person that you should never, ever lie to is yourself. Oh, even when I say that one, it's like, I'm like, ooh, that's a good one. Anyway, that's my first idea for you and a bit of a suggestion around identity. That the most graceful identity to be in is always to be exactly where you are. The second piece of guidance or insight I'd like to offer is don't assume that your career will be worse. Just don't assume. It could be worse or it could be better. I actually just recently told this idea to a friend of mine who is pregnant right now, who is having her first child, because she had shared with me that she was worried about her career once her baby was out. So this particular idea has been kind of top of mind for me. I'm just going to say it again. Don't assume your career will be worse. I'm actually an example of someone who has been a lot more successful after kids, despite, and I want to be really explicit here, despite having much less capacity and time after having kids. But my business has been a lot more successful in basically every metric. I am genuinely a better coach. I help people more and more effectively. I make more money and my reach is wider. All of that since having kids. Part of that, of course, is just doing it longer. The more years that I work on my business, the more effective I am at it. But also, I think there are two other things that contributed to it. One of them is that maternity leave was a surprisingly clarifying time for me. And to be clear, this is not to say that I got work done for my business on maternity leave. Ha 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 ha. All the moms out there are cackling at the idea of getting work done for your business over maternity leave. But I think it was just this complete and total break from even thinking about my business for 4 months. And when I came back, I felt really fresh mentally, and I could see my business with new eyes. So that was the first thing. And the second thing is that I think because motherhood seemed to me like this obvious limiting factor in, at least in terms of time, it forced me to get radically more clear about what I wanted and, more importantly, about what was going to need to happen for me to get there. And as a result, I made some really strategic financial investments. I got myself a lot more support in my business and in my life. I spent, in the time after having kids, way more than I have ever spent on support. And the ROI on that support has been worth it many times over. It has given far more back to me than I spent across the board. And I will also say, hearing this, it might be easy for at least some of you listening to think, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking, oh, well, that was possible for Katie because she has her own business, she works for herself, so there's a lot of potential for growth. But actually, my husband has also had huge growth in his career since having kids. He's had salary growth and a really significant promotion to an area that he wasn't even really qualified for on paper. He got it really on the strength of his reputation for excellent work. All of that since having kids. And he does work in a very corporate-y kind of job. And I know, I'll say again, if you were me, you might be kind of rolling your eyes and thinking, oh yeah, well, men aren't really hurt by having kids. But I mentioned my husband because he has actually done all of that career growth while also working fewer hours. Before we had kids, he not infrequently would work late. But since having kids, he's home at 6 p.m. basically every night to help me put the kids to bed, and he almost never brings his laptop home. I was talking to him about this recently, and he told me that he really believes that having kids forced him to get really strategic about how to deliver the same value in less time. And he feels that it has made him more effective overall, not less effective overall. And ultimately, look, there is no way to make guarantees, but I just want to be a mom further along the path saying, hey, it might go differently than you expect with your career. And also as a coach, I want to name, what if you set an intention to have your career grow in a way that you really liked, while also attending to motherhood in a way that you really liked? What support would you need in order to make that happen? Which leads me to my third point, which really is kind of the core of it all, which is, what do you want, Noelle? What do you want? Like, what do you want out of life? What do you want your relative focus of career versus motherhood versus other things that you value to be? It was very striking to me that on one hand, you wrote that you have been 10,000% focused on your career your entire adult life. You literally used the percentage 10,000, which, let's be honest, is 100 times 100%. But also you shared that you are now considering working part-time and from home. And obviously, as I just said, I don't think that working part-time has to mean that your career stops or slows down significantly. But for someone who had been 10,000% career focused, it would be a big change. And it certainly would be less hours of the day spent with this part of your life that you previously had been, again, 10,000% focused on. Ultimately, as a coach, it just made me really curious. Do you want to work part-time and from home? Is that how you want to spend your days? If so, I'm here for it. But also everything you had said about your mom being a stay-at-home mom and just not having a lot of role models for what career and mom together could look like, it just made me really curious. If we were sitting together, I would really nudge you to, no, I'm not even going to say nudge, I'm going to say push you to tell me as explicitly as possible what you dream of. Not what you think is possible, not what you think makes the most sense financially or what you think is kind of quote unquote best for your baby, but just what you want. Like, how many hours per week do you want to work in your dreams, Noelle? How many hours a week would you like to spend with your child in your dreams, Noelle? And what would be your absolute ideal childcare situation? Again, in your dreams. And as part of asking those questions, I would probably point out that you didn't really mention any time for you. In my opinion, that's kind of a common blind spot for parents and especially moms. But another thing I would push you on would be, what amount and in what times would you like there to be time for you? How much of that time do you want? I ask all of these questions about kind of what do you dream of, not to say that there aren't constraints of all kinds. There are absolutely constraints of all kinds. But I find that as a coach, I always want to know the dream scenario first, because we can work backwards from there. Because often, I will say almost always, there is a lot more possibility than we initially imagine if we start with a clear sense of what would be kind of ooey gooey, really awesome. And I will offer myself as an example here of one potential way of organizing a life, just in case it can be helpful to you or to anyone else listening. As I said, I personally find that choosing what we want from a menu is often easier than imagining a brand new meal from scratch. So I just want to offer you and everyone listening at least a few menu options, if that's of service. So in terms of what I want, and remember, I'm really asking you to first, before anything else, name what you want. What I want is to be able to enjoy all the parts of my life. So I want to enjoy my career. I want to enjoy motherhood. And I also just want to enjoy being a human who has a body and a heart and a mind, meaning I want a substantial slice of the pie chart of my life to be just for me. And enjoy to me is a higher standard than just kind of surviving it. So that's important too. And I will name again, this may be different from how you think about it, Noelle, because you in your question mostly brought up career and motherhood. And for me, it's career and motherhood and also space for me with a capital M and a capital E, me. So I may not be the right role model for you, but just in case I could be a role model for anyone, like I said, I'll be more specific about how I personally attend to career and motherhood and life. I do work, obviously. This podcast itself is one small part of my work. And I work what would probably be considered part-time. So I work 20 hours a week or less. Interestingly, I have been working essentially part-time since before I had kids. I always found 40-hour or more a week jobs very exhausting as a sensitive person. So I also just want to be an example of that possibility, that is a valid choice that someone can make or aspire to, whether or not you have kids. We can work part-time, not just because we're moms, but because we want to. Speaking of role models, I will say, one of my friends, Dave's mom, shout out to Dave's mom, she was a pediatrician and she told me once that she went part-time before she even had kids. She just went part-time for her because she wanted more time for her. And people in her office at the time were like, wait, are you going part-time because you're pregnant? You're about to have kids? And she was like, no, I'm going part-time for me. And I have always thought that that was the best thing ever, that Dave's mom was the role model the world needed. So anyway, in terms of how I arrange my life, I work 20 hours a week or less, and we have a nanny here 40 hours on weekdays. So from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day. I think that's important to mention because I think a lot of moms or a lot of parents, period, only have childcare to cover their like exact working hours. And there's kind of three reasons why we do still have our nanny here 40 hours a week. One is, of course, my 20 hours a week of work are 20 hours of legit focused work. Honestly, many of us, even in a 40-hour kind of quote unquote work week, don't actually do 40 hours of genuinely focused work. So even 30 hours of actual focused work in a quote unquote 40-hour week is probably generous for many salaried employees. But so in order to do those 20 hours, I need to consciously include additional hours for me to kind of breathe between focused work, which would be kind of like built in and more assumed if I had a more corporate job. And the other even more important reason, in my opinion, is that I need some time for me. I have time each day to shower and journal and do my daily practices. And when I need to go to the doctor or get my haircut or run some errands, it happens during this time too. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is that I also do a decent amount of motherhood related activities while our nanny is here that I wouldn't be able to do if she wasn't here. So one of my kids, as I've mentioned, has epilepsy and severe developmental delays. It's a little confusing. Technically, they don't diagnose intellectual disabilities until 5, but on some of our assessments or funding sources, they do call it intellectual disability. Anyway, so I am sometimes popping into his speech therapy sessions or occupational therapy sessions, or we have meetings with teachers from his preschool over Zoom, or I pick him up from preschool twice a week, and then I talk to his teachers then, and my nanny watches my other son during that time. Or we've had a lot of assessments this past month as he has gotten ready to transition to like special education preschool at our school district. That has actually been one of the many things I've been doing these past 2 months. So I've been kind of taking him to many of those while our nanny, again, cares for our other son. And also having this childcare has let me get other kinds of parenting related support that I have really needed. When things were pretty tough emotionally for me last fall, I realized that I really needed support from other parents. So I joined basically would be like a mommy and me group, though it's called a parenting class that I take my other son to, the one who doesn't have epilepsy and delays. It's a 2 hours a week class, which is a pretty substantial amount of time by the time you drive there and drive home and have the class. And we spend half of that time together. So parents and kids playing games and doing crafts and singing songs. And then the other half of the time, the parents, it's really all moms, we go away separately and they have folks who watch our kids and the parents talk about parenting topics and we get advice and support each other. And that has just been very awesome, very nourishing to me over the past year. And while I do that, our nanny will pick up my other son who is not with me from preschool and she'll watch him for a bit. So again, sort of facilitating me being able to do some other parenting and also just supportive things for me. And I have felt wildly fortunate and privileged to be able to have that childcare, to let me have space, not just for my exact tight working hours, but also, again, to care for myself a bit, to do some other parenting and support activities that have been pretty hard to do. I will say, perhaps obviously some of what I've shared and what I do might be more relevant to people with multiple kids, Noelle, and I know you're just about to have just one. And also, of course, I want to acknowledge my enormous privilege and good fortune in being able to have all of that childcare. But I wanted to share about it all the same because I think people don't often get the opportunity to see the behind the scenes of how others spend their time and money. And I want to give just at least one example in case it gives permission to anyone listening to have some time while their children are cared for to care for themselves or to do other parenting or support activities that they otherwise wouldn't get a chance to do. And I do also want to be really explicit and say that I feel really grateful for my mom as a role model here. My mom was a lawyer for her whole career. She actually did make partner at kind of like a mid-sized law firm in LA before having me. And she gradually went part-time as she had more kids. So I'm the third of three. I have two older brothers. And one thing she kind of casually mentioned to me a few times, especially once I had kids, was this idea that childcare doesn't have to be just for your working hours. I remember after I had kids, she said to me really casually, oh yeah, I used to sometimes use the time when the nanny or the babysitter was here to kind of take a solo walk because I really like taking a solo walk. You could do that too. Or I think when she said to me, oh yeah, I would often leave you with the nanny and then take just your brother and run errands and we would have special time together. And again, that last example in particular applies maybe more to folks with multiple kids, but I just want to share it because overall, I again felt really grateful for her as a role model of a working mom and also as a mom who did have childcare, but also used that childcare for a variety of things, not just working. So I want to share that possibility with you too. But ultimately, as I said, I think the key question really is, what do you want? And to really push yourself to define that as specifically and precisely as you can. And only after you've done that, see how you can make it happen. Which leads me to my next point. Get more support than you think you need. That is the fourth thing that I want to say about transitioning to motherhood. Get more support than you think you need. And before we even continue, I want to talk about the many, many different forms that support can take. I think there's at least 4 high-level forms or kind of buckets of support, in my mind at least. The first and most obvious one is childcare, someone or some organization that does take care of your child. This could be your kind of main childcare during the week, like a nanny or a daycare during working hours, but it also might be a night nanny or a babysitter on weekends. A second form of support is what I call life care. This could be a cleaning person. We actually we cleaned our house ourselves before having kids, but after having kids, we now have cleaning people, and that is amazing. Or it could be prepare foods that you pick up from the grocery store so you don't have to cook. That is another way in which I have allowed myself to be supported a lot more since having kids. So whatever supports you with simplifying and finding energy for your day-to-day life, I consider that this kind of second type of support. A third form of support is certainly like emotional support for you, a therapist or a coach. And a fourth kind is community support. A parenting group, I mentioned that I'm in this parenting group, or a group of friends who you see regularly. I suspect you know this, Noelle, but there are a lot of these groups that really come up around having newborns that you can just join, even if you don't know anyone. And you can meet a bunch of moms who also have newborns at the same age. That's just super helpful. I was in one of those when my kids were first born. And then I stopped because I was like, well, that's a lot of time. I don't know. And then as I mentioned, I joined a different one when my kids were a little over 2 because I decided then that I needed some more parenting support. So I just lay all of those out at the beginning to say, when I am talking about support, it's not just childcare. It can come in many forms. And if you remember nothing else from this podcast, remember this. Get yourself more support than you think you need. I'll say it again because it's that important. Get yourself more support than you think you need. Look how feisty I am about this. I really feel very strongly about this one. Okay, there are a few things that I want to say about that while we are talking about getting yourself more support than you think you need. The first one is, do not assume that the level of support that other people have is enough. Noelle, you mentioned that you don't have a lot of peers or people who you know your age who could be role models for what it would look like to be a parent. I will say that I actually had a fair number, but in honesty, I didn't necessarily want what many of them were having. I didn't necessarily want them to be my role model. It looked pretty rough for many of them. And frankly, in my opinion, many of the parents of young kids of my acquaintance do not have enough support. And some of you who are parents of young kids may be listening to this and feeling feisty towards me. You might be thinking, well, Katie, I would love some more support, but it's too expensive. And I will say, okay, I want to talk about money in a second, so hold on to that one. But also, not all forms of support require money. Could you do an exchange with a friend? So one of you gets 2 kids every Saturday afternoon, and the other one gets all Saturday afternoon off every other week. That would be completely worth it to me. And that can be support too. Could you create a group of other parents that gets together once a week or once a month and supports each other and talks about topics close to your hearts with your kids or without? That's support too. One amazing form of support is that my mom comes over and hangs out with the kids for a few hours most Sundays. I don't know where your parents or in-laws live, Noelle, but if that's possible for you, that could be a really great option. And I will name, sometimes things like this are possible, like the grandparents are game, but they don't offer. So we have to ask for it. But overall, I just want to say it again. I'm repeating myself. You have noticed because it's that important. Noelle, you will likely eventually know more parents. You will know more moms in particular. You will join a parenting group. Your child will go to daycare. Do not assume that these other parents have enough support. They probably do not have enough support. Again, get yourself more support than you think you need. Okay, the second thing I want to say about getting more support than you think you need is to look for examples of people who are good at getting support. One kind of shining star role model to me here as an example of someone who actually had a great level of support was one of my brothers and his wife, my sister-in-law. They both have full-time jobs, and I know that their lives aren't perfect, but as I looked around at all the parents that I knew, they seemed remarkably like they also had decent energy, and they were generally pretty happy. And frankly, I was impressed. And it was very clear to me that a big part of why they were doing so well was that they were well supported. They had a night nanny when their first daughter was born. They were actually one of the only people who I knew personally who had ever had a night nanny. And I say that because we ended up hiring a night nanny when our kids were born. It turns out it's something that's decently common in the twin parent community, at least in major cities. And speaking from the other side, hiring our night nanny was perhaps the best money we have spent in our entire lives, without exaggeration. I think my husband especially would say that. But I think part of why I felt more comfortable and confident doing it was because someone I already knew, my brother and my sister-in-law, had already done it. And then I also knew that once my sister-in-law had gone back to work after maternity leave, they had hired a full-time nanny. And it was from talking to them and really watching them live their lives that I and my husband and I decided that it would be a better route for us than daycare, even though we had always assumed that we would do daycare, both because I work from home and I actually wanted the house to myself during the day, and also because even with 2, daycare was still less expensive. But it has ended up being true that having a nanny was I'm just taking breaths because it has been enormously helpful to us. It has made my life so much calmer in just a whole myriad of ways. And I think, again, I felt more comfortable and confident doing that because I had talked to my brother and my sister-in-law about it, and they had recommended it so highly and told me all the ways that it had helped their lives. And then at some point, my brother and my sister-in-law got a babysitter on the weekends for just a couple hours each day. I mentioned this in my podcast on burnout, but my husband and I sort of very late 2021, we're going through a pretty rough time because of some of the things around one of my sons I've mentioned. And I was like, oh my gosh, my brother and sister-in-law have a weekend babysitter. We should get a weekend babysitter. That's a great idea. So I share that because I think part of what holding people back from getting more support is 2 things. First, we just can't even imagine the possibilities for support. Like certain possibilities don't even occur to us. You mentioned, Noelle, that you don't have any role models. So I want to offer some possibilities. And second, I think that we often think even if we could imagine it, that it's not something that kind of quote unquote good parents do. Like, people who are good parents don't get a babysitter in the daytime for a few hours every weekend. I mean, sure, while you're working, it's okay. And maybe kind of a date night here or there while your kids are already asleep, but in the daytime, on the weekends. But it was so clear to me that my brother and my sister-in-law, they're excellent parents. They're very loving, very present. I could not feel that way more strongly. And yeah, they have a babysitter in the daytime, on the weekends, for a few hours. And honestly, I believe that my husband and I are excellent parents, and we have a babysitter every Saturday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So we can go and do things on our own. And it's amazing. I can go to a yoga class and take myself out to lunch and run errands, and my husband can do whatever the heck he wants. I could not recommend it more highly. And I mean, I believe the kids are napping for 2 hours at that time. So really it's only 3 awake hours that we're not spending with them. So I share that. If you, or if anyone else needs it, I want to share my own role models, and I want to let myself be a role model. I have a lot of support. You can certainly hear that. And I strongly believe that you can be a good parent and get a lot of support. And the third topic I want to explore around getting more support than you think you need is money. Look, certain kinds of support cost money. There is no way around it. But there's 3 things I want to say about money. The first is, I would invite you to be open to money coming from a variety of sources. I know several friends who have shared with me that their parents or their spouse's parent or their grandma help pay for childcare. And again, I'm not saying that that's available to everyone. That's an enormous privilege. But just again, to give some examples of what's possible and to invite you to examine your thoughts about what that might mean if you receive that kind of support. Sometimes people are happy to help. People in your life are happy to help, but you may also have to ask. And you might have to, again, explore your thoughts about what it means to have to ask. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that on a totally personal level, parenthood has invited me, we can say, to profoundly examine and shift my feelings about spending money. I have invested a lot in support. Obviously, you can hear the childcare form of support, but also I have never spent money on coaching like I have after after having kids. And that money is from my own bank account. And the returns on the money I've spent have been worth it many, many times over, both the extra childcare and the coaching. So I just want to let myself be at least a sample size of 1 there. So to say, it is possible that spending more might be hard or it might feel like a stretch, but it might provide outsized returns. It's possible. It certainly did happen for me. And the third and final thing I want to say about money is, look, I do not know the exact contents of the bank accounts of any of you listening to this. But I will also say, as I look around to people I know and people I work with, it is clear to me that most of them, not all, but most of them could afford 10 to 15% more support than they currently have. That would translate to maybe a few hours of a babysitter on the weekend, or maybe an extra hour each weekday so they could get a workout in that they like. Or they just have an extra hour to read a novel before going on parent duty again. Can you tell examples of things that I like doing? And of course, you can choose not to spend that money. It's always a beautiful thing to save money. But also, remember, if you do feel that you need more support and you do feel that you want more support, it does not mean that you have to double your spending. You might just spend 10% more. And the returns on that might, I won't say will, because your brain might not be willing to accept that. I'll just say might. They might be very well worth it. So that's especially for all those of you who are sitting there being like, well, Katie, I'd love it, but it's too expensive. Like, what about 10% more support? And the fourth and last kind of high level point that I want to make about getting more support than you think you need is, ideally, don't wait until you're backed into a corner to get more support. Look, have there been times when I was backed into a corner, when I was just absolutely exhausted and at the end of my rope? Yes. And have I gotten more support then? Yes. But also, I have been at my best when I have looked ahead and been like, yeah, let's get ahead of this problem. A great example of this, as I alluded to before, is with our beloved night nanny. I had several conversations with twin moms further along the path while I was pregnant. And I heard a bunch of very tough stories about really tough postpartum depression and radical exhaustion and just very, very challenging times because, you know, the intersection of both babies sleeping at the same time is far less than with just one. And I was like, I wonder if I can avoid that because that sounds terrible. So as I was freaking out, we made the decision to hire our night nanny. And as a result, I got a decent amount of sleep. I did wake up twice a night to still pump or feed my kids, but I still got a solid amount of sleep in between that. And as a result, maternity leave is a happy memory for me. And I can feel it in my body as I say that. I think probably very few twin moms can say that. What could have been a total shit show, let's be honest, is actually a very special memory for me. And that was because I had a ton of support. And again, that support was worth every penny to me. So ideally, if possible, don't wait until you're trapped in a corner to get more support. And the last thing I want to say, just very high level about this question of transitioning gracefully to motherhood, is to always remember that you are going to do different things at different times. You will do different things at different times. It's very odd being pregnant in a way because you have all this time to anticipate and you want to come up with this great plan. But honestly, it's pretty hard to know how you will feel as a parent until you actually are one. And then once you are one, things will change every 3 months or 6 months or a year. So I also just want to say, you're going to make a set of decisions around career and motherhood and time and trade-offs, but also please give yourself full permission to change your mind once the baby is out, and then permission to change your mind 3 and 6 and 12 months later. You might go from part-time work to full-time work and back to part-time, or daycare to nanny to a different daycare. Kids change so fast in these early years, and we as parents change so fast in these early years too. So I hope you will give yourself grace, and I hope you will give yourself a chance to find out what you enjoy as it evolves and just do as much of that as possible. So Noelle, this is just a bunch of ideas that I hope are helpful to you and to any other potential mother or parent or early mother or parent who is listening to this. And finally, obviously, if we are talking about transitioning well to motherhood, there are so many other things that do help with that. Everything from birth plans, to sleep training, to feeding schedules, to lactation consultants, to stroller selection. And let me just say, as probably every veteran mom probably does, I have strong opinions about all of it. So if you want my just another mom, not a professional opinions about any of that, email me. But I will just stay in my kind of life coaching lane here on the podcast and focus on this kind of career versus motherhood priorities and identity question you brought up. And beyond everything else, I just want to say, I am rooting for you as a person and as a mom. How lucky your child is to have such a thoughtful parent. I just know that you've got this, Noelle. And everybody, I'm rooting for you. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.